welcome everybody. Um, Matthew Dowling is our presenter today, and I'm going to just turn it over to you, Matthew, to maximize the amount of time we are in your hands. We are recording today's session, so just be mindful of that.
Very good. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for allowing me not only to be a part of this group, which is such a rich fellowship opportunity for me. I don't interact with any chaplains from the Stone Campbell tradition. That is sad. So I'm thankful to be a part of this group. And I have been a hospital chaplain. I started training in January of 2020. That was an exciting time to onboard into CPE and our system, which is Trinity Health Michigan. Trinity Health being the second largest Catholic healthcare system in the country is where I trained, and we remained in the hospital throughout COVID in 2021. And I was very thankful to get hired into Trinity Health, and I work at Trinity Health Ann Arbor. It used to be part of the St. Joseph Mercy Health System, and it's a 560 bed teaching hospital, large campus in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so we, along with our bigger colleagues across the way at the University of Michigan, are kind of the two big regional medical centers, not including, of course, some of the big ones in Detroit. I work as a full-time staff chaplain and have unit assignments in the surgical and neurocritical ICU and on the cancer floor, oncology, and specifically to our topic today in the area of palliative care. I'm a part of the palliative care team, so I appreciate you inviting me to share a little bit more about that. And I want to begin with a story just to illustrate perhaps the importance of spiritual care in general when it comes to whole person care. So we had a gentleman in his late 70s who had some vascular disease issues in one of his lower limbs. I think it was his right leg, which are we're going to need some kind of intervention. Either he was going to have a below the knee amputation, or if he decided not to have that surgery, he was going to need to go home with a hospice disposition. Well, for about 7 days, the primary attending physician he and his team had gone in and tried to get a decision out of this nice gentleman, and he had not been willing to make one, much to their consternation. And so Uh, Day 7, they consulted with the palliative care team. The palliative care provider went in, tried to elicit a decision, was not able to get one. And I think as a kind of Hail Mary, they threw me in on day 9, I believe it was, to see if I could suss out why he wasn't making a decision. So I went to go visit, and as soon as I got to the room, um, he and what I learned was his wife in the room. They both were like, "Oh, the chaplain's here to see us. Can you come back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.?" And I said, "Okay, I'll come back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m." And I did. And as soon as I got into the room, his wife stood up really with like great kind of flair and said, "I'm going to go down to the hospital coffee shop and get a muffin and get a coffee. You two guys sit down and talk together." And she dramatically exited, closed the door. So I was on. So I sat down on the little bedside stool and um, asked, uh, what, what would you like to talk about today? And so he sat there for a moment, pretty quiet, and I could feel some of the emotion simmering under the surface. And just the instinct I think all of us have had is sometimes people need to get things off their chest or even make like a confession type thing, which is what this gentleman wanted to do. And so I just asked him, I said, "Is there something that you wanted to tell me?" And he began breaking down in tears and he said, "There is." And he went on to detail how many, many years earlier he had been a number of times unfaithful to his wife, the lady that had just left. And he wanted to know if forgiveness from God was possible. He was carrying a tremendous amount of guilt and shame from this, and he was seeking after God's forgiveness. This was something that was a part of his background, his spirituality, and so we talked at length about that. We had a rich time of prayer where he just kind of poured his heart out to God, and I did all of the things I could, offering sacred text and just the assurance of God's love. And it was a very rich, rich time, and we really went through that together. And as it wrapped up, on the door, here came his wife. And I thought at that one point, my visit there was concluded at least. And so I thought, well, I'll give them some time together and things like that. Well, as soon as I started to stand up and she was entering the room, he said, no, 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 sit down, sit down, sit down. He said, stay for just a minute, chaplain. So I sat down, and he brought, his wife, he called her over to the other side of the bed, and he said, honey, come over here and sit down beside me. There's something I need to tell you. And I remember feeling kind of the weight of this, and even feeling some anxiousness about it, because I thought, well, it sounds to me like he's going to tell her everything that he just told me. And so I really was quiet, kind of watching this unfold and things like that. And he did. He disclosed all of the things that he had just told me. And of course, at this point, I'm just kind of present with them, and I'm watching because I'm not sure exactly how she's going to react. And once he told her, she looked really intently at him and said, I've always known. And she said, I told myself that the day you told me that I would offer my forgiveness to you. And it was a pretty incredible moment. And I don't know everybody's history here on the call. You may have had relationships with partners where infidelity was involved. I'm not suggesting that her reaction has to be your reaction. Yeah, I'm just kind of reporting what the interaction between these two was like. And she showed a lot of grace. Now he was surprised that she knew. And you may not be surprised, but he was surprised. And he asked her, he said, well, how did you know? And she told him, she said, you accused me of things years ago that I would never in my imagination have imagined doing. And I just assumed you were projecting your own guilt onto me. And so that's how we've come to the point where I am. I told myself I would forgive you if you ever asked, and I do forgive you. And they embraced each other, and there was a lot of tears and a lot of things like that. Now, what does that have to do with palliative care chaplaincy? The very next thing that he did after this interaction between he and his wife is he turned to me and he said, Chaplain, you can tell the doctors that I do not want the surgery, that I'm ready to go on hospice care now. And his goals of care became very clear. His decision was made, and he arrived at this decision point that they had been hoping he would for some days now. And so I offer that story as just a little bit of a window into some of the kind of chaplaincy work that happens within the interdisciplinary team of palliative care. And palliative care is a team, and it's a consult service in our hospital and yours if you're in the hospital systems that really comes alongside people with complicated illness. And within a continuum of care since about 2018, the World Health Organization has wanted patients that need it to receive palliative care to support them psychosocially in terms of symptoms and other things like that. And so I have become a part of that care team in our hospital. And what I'd like to do today is just share some of my impressions of the work of palliative care chaplaincy, what I call spiritual care at the edge. And what I mean by the edge is oftentimes palliative care, spiritual care is offered to people that are at pivot points in their life, points where they're making decisions, points where they have to determine what their own goals of care and goals of life and other type things are. And oftentimes we're able to be there with them. And of course, when I moved into this specialty, I thought I understood what I was getting into. Uh, we've all done chaplaincy in different ways. We've sat with dying patients. Those of you are in different types of spiritual care roles, hospice roles, and things like that, that's very common. We've all likely supported grieving families. So, how different could palliative care be? Well, it turns out in some ways it was pretty different, more different than I expected. And not just in terms of the medical complexity or the team dynamics, those things were significant, but it was different in ways that have even changed how I kind of think of chaplaincy itself, how I think about suffering, and what it means to walk with people through these profound experiences they have. So I'd like to take you into the work just a little bit. And I don't pretend to be a teacher in this space. In fact, I think you all could probably teach me a lot more than I can share with you. But I just want to share what I've discovered in the trenches of palliative care and what it's taught me. So I find that when I tell people, even in the team here that I work in, I'm really blessed to be a part of an amazing spiritual care team here. Um, when I tell them I'm the palliative care chaplain, they often get a particular look on their face, and it's a look of part sympathy and part curiosity and almost part relief that it's not their job. And I have a lot of the learners, because we're a CPE education center here, who'll say, that must be so depressing, or how do you handle all that death? But here's the thing, death is certainly a part of palliative care, but it is not just the dominant theme. I spend most of my days with people who are very much alive, who are dealing with the complex challenges, really living well, and also living with serious illness. And I find that I talk a lot more about dreams and hopes than I do about, funeral plans or advanced care planning and things like that. And so I'm excited about this work. Let me tell you about a 54-year-old woman. I've changed the names. Her name, we'll call her Maria. She had pancreatic cancer. And when I first met her, she was in because of complications to do with her chemotherapy. She had already been given about 6 months to live, but um, continued to be seen and admitted to the hospital off and on for about 18 months. So she exceeded expectations. We would see each other during each hospitalization. And I found that oftentimes Maria was not preparing for death, but she was trying to focus on how to fully live while going through treatment. And we talked about all kinds of things, from her daughter's wedding plans. She had returned to oil painting, which had been a real passion of hers years ago. She had a very complicated relationship with an ex-husband that she wanted to kind of work through. And of course, yes, she had fears about dying. We talked about all of those things. And what I found is that we talked a lot more about living than we did dying. And what was new to me about palliative care was sometimes the long-term relationship that happens in that space. In other settings of chaplaincy, I might see someone for a trauma visit, which is very brief, or a crisis visit, or just a brief hospitalization. But in palliative care, I've found it's possible to become more a part of people's lives. I'll learn grandchildren's names and what somebody's favorite restaurant is, or pet peeves they have. I hear a lot about pet peeves when it comes to the medical team. And it's a neat intimacy because it creates kind of a privilege and a challenge in a lot of ways. And I think I just want to speak to that for a minute. One of the things about palliative care chaplaincy, which was interesting, is how integrated I needed to become with a medical team. Um, you know, I recognized pretty early on, you don't just get consulted when somebody's dying or having spiritual distress. You end up, in this team at least, becoming a part of initial assessments, and you're a part of treatment planning meetings and a lot of family conferences. And last week, I was in a meeting where we were discussing whether to recommend a feeding tube for a patient with advanced dementia, which is, it's a thorny question, really. And I was able to offer input in there. My input wasn't just about the family's spiritual needs, it was about their values and what their understanding of quality of life was, and how their own cultural beliefs about food and care intersected. So, a lot of integration into the team. And that integration has meant that I've learned a lot more about medicine than I ever thought I would. Years ago, I was a CNA and a trauma tech in the ED, so I had some medical background before I got into ministry and chaplaincy. But even during that time, um, I've learned a lot from palliative care. I, we discuss things with our team like symptom burden and functional status and performance scales with physicians. I didn't know about any of that stuff before entering into this work. The difference between palliative sedation and euthanasia, which is very important, of course, specifically in our healthcare system. What comfort feeding is versus medically appropriate nutrition. A lot of medical literacy, and that's created some tensions for me. I mean, sometimes I disagree with medical recommendations based on what I know about a family's values or their spiritual needs, or sometimes I see psychological or spiritual dynamics that I think are affecting medical decision making. And so it's fascinating to be integrated into a team so deeply, but then your voice to really be heard and your voice to count for things. And so I've had to learn about, when to use my authority, when to speak up, and when to hold back. And that's been an ongoing process. Uh, Perhaps the biggest shift in my practice as a chaplain has been truly treating the family as a unit of care. I think that's always in the background of chaplaincy. In other settings, I supported family members, but often the patient was the primary focus in those encounters. In palliative care, I find that the boundary between patient and family almost dissolves entirely. Um, I had a man in his late 60s within the last month who had heart failure. And technically, he was the patient, but his wife was exhausted from caregiving. Their adult son was avoiding visits because he couldn't handle seeing his father decline. Their daughter, an adult daughter, was mad at everybody in the family system, mad at everybody in the medical team for not fighting harder. And I spent as much time with her as I did with anybody else, working through guilt she had about feeling overwhelmed. And I had a lot of difficult conversations with the adult son about grief and presence and some of his own decisions about being present or not present. I helped the daughter understand that love doesn't always look like aggressive medical intervention. And so a family system really becomes the patient in some ways. And I've seen how that is a really interesting and difficult work. Families in this space often they struggle with role reversals, and there's anticipatory grief and competing values about medical decisions. And you may find yourself in this kind of work navigating situations where adult children are making decisions for parents, and there's disagreement about treatment goals, and family members have different spiritual frameworks for understanding illness. And so if you like to wade into the middle of that and try to help families and even act as a mediator, because families are holding different beliefs about the appropriateness of life sustaining treatment, this might be the area for you. Um, People all have different views about the meaning of suffering. And there's a lot of different views about the role of divine intervention and healing. And so these conflicts I've found can paralyze decision making. And if not handled well and supported well, can actually create lasting family divisions. And so being able to work in that space is very meaningful, but also very challenging. And of course, everybody deals with grief differently. Different family members, I find, are often at radically different stages of grief and acceptance. And one person may be planning for death. You've likely showed up to end of life encounters where the person is not passed away yet, but somebody in the family is already making funeral arrangements and things like that. While the other is on their phone in the room researching experimental treatments that might sustain their loved one's life. So um, those are all a part, I think, of the ecosystem of caring for families. I've learned other things in palliative care. My assumption going into palliative care was that people facing spiritual, or excuse me, facing serious illness would be more spiritually open, more interested in existential questions, maybe even more receptive to chaplain care. That has been true in ways. It's also been completely false in other ways. Um, I do think that, of course, spiritual illness or serious illness often precipitates spiritual crisis and openness. We've all seen how people who haven't thought about God in decades suddenly have urgent questions about prayer or the afterlife or what is God doing and all this. But I've also encountered more often than not people who become very angry, even if I mention the word spiritual, and patients who are so focused on fighting their disease that they have no interest in meaning making conversations or anything like that. And I mean, to be honest with you, and you all do this work, I've often found families where their religious beliefs create more conflict than they do comfort. And so, what I've learned from that is I've learned not just to assess what people believe, but how it is that they actually want to engage with their beliefs in the context of illness. Some patients do want really intense spiritual exploration. Others, for example, in our Catholic healthcare system, where we do get a lot of Catholic patients for that reason, oftentimes families here just want their chaplain to simply ensure that their loved one receives last rites when the time comes, that end of life sacrament of the sick. Others want help reconciling their faith with their diagnosis. But then others, and this was, I remember the first time I encountered this, it was really, kind of a new thing for me. Other people want support in maintaining their secular worldview in the face of well meaning religious friends and family. And I was a minister for 15 years in the Churches of Christ before I became a minister. And I remember the first time I was supporting somebody in their secular worldview while family were trying to come at them and evangelize them and stuff. I thought, boy, I really had to set my own things aside, and that was a new spiritual dynamic to wrestle with that really made me think deeply about who I am as a chaplain and what I'm here to do. Despite those many challenges, one of the most surprising aspects of the work of palliative care has been the presence of joy. And I'm not talking about just happiness, but like real and profound, unexpected joy in the midst of serious illness, even approaching death. Um, I think it was about 2 years ago, we had an older female patient in her early 80s with, I can't remember if it was like advanced COPD or interstitial lung disease, but it was kind of end stage respiratory failure type thing. She could barely walk across the hospital room without getting winded. And during one of the visits that I had with her, she told me she had never seen the ocean. And that was one of her kind of bucket list items, but she was lamenting that she probably would never see this. Well, she wanted to walk on a beach and see the ocean. So her granddaughter, who was visiting at the time, immediately her like mental wheels start turning, right? And she's like, Grandma, we're going to the beach. We got to make this happen. Well, the patient's face lit up at the idea of this because she's really excited. And they spent the next hour or so looking at pictures of beaches on a phone and planning what they would be able to do and what they wouldn't. I mean, sadly, I just have to tell you, the reality was she couldn't leave the hospital. She was end stage. She was requiring really high levels of oxygen, BiPAP at night, things like that. But she wanted to be on the beach and seeing an ocean. Now, did they make that trip? They did not. But her daughter, or granddaughter, somehow gained permission from the floor and the nurse management team to bring in quite a bit of sand to the room. I don't really know how much it ended up being. It wasn't like a beach worth, but enough sand that she could like walk on it in the room. I don't know if they had some kind of agreement that she would clean all this up and haul it off or whatever, but we're able to bring some sand into the room, and she had we have these TVs that roll on the carts, the big, large kind of 60 something inch, but they brought it in, they had a scene of a beach and facilitated this out of the ICU. And it ended up being this really beautiful moment where this patient. She experienced joy. She ended up dying several weeks later. She had gone home, but ended up bouncing back to the hospital, and we had to do a terminal wean on her while she was here. But it was just a cool thing. It was cool to see her granddaughter and her get so excited to try to at least make, with all the restrictions, this kind of moment happen. And even though maybe it was fulfilled in a way that didn't quite meet what she wanted, I find that dreams realized in the shadow of death create for me real, I don't know, profound joy. You know, the reconciliations of relationships or people that have been estranged who do come to the hospital. That happens more often than I might have expected before this work. And I would say the takeaway for me because of that has been that hope doesn't always require a cure, you know. Meaning can emerge even when there's all these like life limiting limitations. And it's not always possible to fight, but life really can happen when we stop fighting what is and start kind of embracing what's possible. Um, I want to stop there for just a second. I I meant to mention at the beginning, I'd love this to be dialogical and for others to be able to share or ask questions or even share your own experiences that have kind of resonated. Maybe I could pause here for a moment and just ask if there's any comments or thoughts or things that others would like to ask or share at this point before I kind of dive into the back half of some more reflecting on palliative care. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask or share? It's okay if not.
This is Paul Arnold. I'm calling from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have a question for Chaplain Dowling.
That's very formal, Paul, since you're one of my best friends, but go for it.
Um, I know when we worked together, you were with intensive care quite a bit, and that was your primary focus. And now you find yourself primarily dedicated to palliative care. Are there things that you miss about intensive care, or has it been just a good switch for you?
I haven't been able to give up intensive care altogether. In fact, I still cover the surgical and neurocrit ICU. And oftentimes palliative is in that space, so we've maintained that assignment. And um, I I've been able to offload some of the work in oncology because the three of those areas were just a little bit too much. But the thing that I think is most challenging about palliative care is in our neurocritical ICU, we often have patients with devastating brain injuries and have to navigate oftentimes situations involving brain death. And those to me are some of the most challenging things. I would not miss that if I had to give it up, but I'm also really honored to be a part of that. I think in the triage of like hardest ICU places to work, you know, there's pediatric like burn ICUs or there's burn ICUs, but neurocritical ICUs are really tough because you have young people, for example, you know, who've tried to take their own life and have shot themselves in the head and survived it, you know, or you have people who um, were super functional at baseline, very active, healthy older adults who happened to be on Eliquis or a blood thinner of some kind and just tripped on the sidewalk and fell and devastating brain bleed. And so I think those things are really tough. But I do miss some of the cancer work a little bit just because I think that's a space that really needs a rich chaplain presence. I'm thankful for those of you who might be on today who work as cancer chaplains because I just think that's an amazing space to work. And Paul and I, when we worked together, we had a really gifted chaplain who now works in outpatient cancer chaplaincy named Kim, and she's an exceptional chaplain. And so I'm glad that she's continuing that work. But yeah, Paul, I haven't given it up, so keeping on in ICU.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Any others that want to share or chime in? If not, I'll talk a little bit about what I've learned about just chaplaincy in general from being a palliative care chaplain. Um, In the palliative space, we all know about the ministry of presence. Um, and what I've seen is all chaplains, we know about the ministry of presence, but palliative care has taught me that presence is sometimes maybe more complex than I understood. Sometimes presence means sitting quietly with someone as they vent their feelings and cry. Presence sometimes means advocating for better pain control so that um, a patient can be more present with their family. Sometimes that advocacy and the ministry of presence looks like, because the palliative care team also does pain consults and treats complicated pain, advocating for young African American patients who maybe their pain is not being addressed because they have sickle cell disease, and really advocating with attendings and things like that. So presence can be a lot of different things. Recently, my presence or ministry of presence meant helping a patient write letters to grandchildren because they would, you know, never see them graduate. Um, and at other times it means making sure that certain cultural rituals are honored in our hospital system. Um, I wasn't here. I was at another facility at Trinity Health Hospital before I came here, but I had a patient who was Jewish Orthodox, a woman who was dying during Passover. And her family wanted to hold a Seder in the hospital room, but there are institutional concerns about like food restrictions and space limitations and infection control. And ministry of presence for this particular intervention wasn't like I was just going to provide spiritual support. I had to kind of work and advocate with the nurse manager and the medical team, the primary team, to actually make this ritual possible. We ended up being able to accommodate the dietary restrictions, and we arranged for the family to all gather in this room, even though it violated our visitor policy. And we got the family members in there to participate safely. And this Seder became one of the more sacred experiences I've really ever witnessed. The patient, she was really kind of barely conscious. She'd been in a lot of pain and other things like that, but like for this moment, she seemed more present than she had been. And she would kind of stir and she would smile when she heard the familiar prayers that were being offered. And her children and grandchildren were there and they were sharing memories and there's crying together and celebrating, all of their joint faith in this shared room. And she actually ended up just dying a couple days later. It was a terminal admission. And my presence wasn't just about being there in this instance, it was making sure that the presence of all this family and this ritual could happen. And I really was impacted by that early on. And I thought, this chaplaincy thing is pretty amazing. Um, so learning about the complexity of our ministry of presence has been a rich experience. Um, we all know as chaplains that we can't fix people's problems. But I think palliative care for me has taught me about the limits of fixing in ways that maybe previously were a little abstract. And what I mean with that is, when you sit with people who are watching their loved one die, or with spouses who are losing partners after 50 or 60 years of marriage, or, people facing their own mortality, while dreams remain unfulfilled. We had a 42-year-old father of two, and passed some comfort care here the other day, had a terrible GI lymphoma. And, I remember listening several of the course of several visits about all these things that he wanted to do, and these things were basically going to remain unfulfilled. Well, the magnitude of that kind of unfixable suffering, I think it can be sometimes kind of staggering. And so I know that we can't fix people, but I've also learned, if I could like flip the coin on this, I've learned that people don't always need fixing. I think sometimes people need us to be witnesses, to affirm that their experiences really matter, that their life has meaning, and that, the love they have for their family and friends and loved ones and things can transcend their own death. I was up in our surgical ICU yesterday, and there was one of those cases where really healthy at baseline, active older woman had fallen and was on a blood thinner and developed a devastating brain bleed. Her whole field was flooded, and her husband was there, just the nicest guy ever, and reminded me a lot of my grandfather, actually. And, um, I'm introducing myself after the neurocritical physician has gone in to basically say neurosurgery's declined doing interventions. We don't have any further treatments that we can offer. We're just basically able to offer comfort care type support and stuff. And so right after that, they're like, hey, Matthew, go in and offer support. So I go in and introduce myself, and I always find those moments full of like heaviness. And it's just, what are you going to say? Well, he was very sweet, the husband was, because he said, hey, chaplain, I know there's not much you can do. I appreciate you being here. And he said, is there a magic wand somewhere here in the hospital that you could go find that would fix all this? And I just took it for what it was. Back in the day, I would have said, "Oh, I have something better than a magic wand. I have the power of prayer." But I chuckled at that, and I said, "Man, I wish I had that because I would absolutely bring it back here first." And he looked at me really seriously, but thankfully had a twinkle in his eye. He goes, "Well, could you look harder?" And I said, I will for you, sir, because I realize we're looking for a miracle here. And he had a Detroit Tigers baseball hat on, which I don't know if you're baseball fans, but the Detroit Tigers are rocking it this year. And so that's a miracle in and of itself. So I said, well, if God can turn around the Detroit Tigers, let's just ask for a miracle here. And the reality is that she's not going to find healing in this life. She's going to find healing in the next life. But I enjoy being a witness. There was a patient one time in his mid 40s. He was a father of three. He was dying of ALS. And by the time I met him, he could actually hardly even speak. He needed assistance with all his activities and things like that. And this poor family, like his wife was exhausted, his children were struggling in school, the family was just drowning in a lot of ways. Well, I couldn't fix any of those problems. Of course, nobody could. But I could sit with him. And what was difficult was he was using a voice synthesizer. And yet, with that weird kind of synthesizer voice, he went through each of the children in his family, his children. And he told me about each of his children's personalities, right? And it was so beautiful. And I ended up having an opportunity to really sit with his wife and listen to her express her anger and her exhaustion and frustration with God and just be non-judgmentally kind of present to that. And then they had a teenage son that was really struggling with guilt about taking time to hang out with his friends, which he wanted to do, and convincing him that that wasn't abandoning his father. And so we don't fix things, but as we're present to things, we appreciate how much work there is to do. I appreciate the interdisciplinary nature of palliative care. Working as a part of a medical team has expanded my understanding of what ministry looks like. Sometimes it's translating family dynamics for physicians who are frustrated by difficult families. Not every physician has a great bedside manner and is patient with families. And so sometimes we're an intermediary there. Um, a lot of our social workers here are incredible, incredible people. Some of them have subconscious and even conscious biases against patients and family spirituality. And so sometimes being a part of the team here means helping a social worker understand the spiritual dimensions of a patient's refusal of some kind of intervention and even advocating for that. Um, I've learned to see ministry in the conversations with nurses who are struggling with their own grief after losing patients. I don't know where all of you work at here. We regularly have new nurses who are new nurse grads that are into the profession. And there's a lot of times where they are experiencing their first patient death. Well, I've been to hundreds and hundreds of deaths. And so normalizing those things and honoring them. Paul, who you heard ask a question or make a comment earlier, when we worked together, he was really great about empowering us to share these cards that honor the spirit of our founding with the Sisters of Mercy out of Dublin, Ireland, and Catherine McCauley. And we give the nurses, when patients die, a little gift card that they can take down to get a comfortable cup of tea or a coffee or something like that, a refreshment at our coffee shop in the hospital. And inside of it is a thank you note to them, thanking them for caring for a patient at the end of life. And, when you often read that to the nurses when they've experienced a death, it brings tears to their eyes and stuff. So, being a part of a team, seeing these sacred moments in team culture or in meetings where we process the emotional toll of the work, it's given me a broader understanding of ministry that has shown me how chaplaincy functions in all these different levels. And, the sacred work that you all do isn't just confined to bedside conversations or in the formal rituals that we're asked to perform. It really emerges within these little soft spaces, the nurses' nooks and the charting stations and leaning over one of the computer carts on wheels, when you're offering care. And that care, I think, in my palliative care work has really helped me to push me to develop cultural competence in the ways that feel more urgent than in other settings. When somebody's dying, cultural and spiritual authenticity become really, really important. There's not really a space for generic one size fits all spiritual care when everybody is different. So maybe you need to sit with a Muslim family during Ramadan and try to understand how fasting requirements interact with medication schedules for dying patients, or supporting Buddhist patients who want to remain conscious and alert during the dying process for spiritual reasons when that kind of works against comfort care orders. Each of those experiences and others like them have taught me new things about spirituality and healthcare, and have taught me about my own limits. I don't really understand the way everybody views the end of life and approaching complicated illness. So I'm thankful for these experiences. Uh, and I'm also thankful that I now realize in this work how deeply spiritual medical decision making can be. Decisions about life support, about aggressive treatments, or about things like comfort care, those are not just medical decisions or even practical decisions. They are profound expressions about what we value and about how we understand life's meaning. And, sitting with families struggling to decide whether to continue dialysis for a loved one with dementia is pretty heartbreaking stuff. And what emerges from that is things that touch on the questions of personhood or quality of life or suffering or hope or divine will. Um, when cancer patients start reaching out for experimental treatments and clinical trials and things like that, weighing hope against acceptance of the end and fighting against surrendering, that's just a really powerful space to be. And I think those decisions require as much spiritual discernment as they do medical information. And if I could just name something about chaplaincy in general that I think has been most affecting to me, is living as close as we do to death has really changed my understanding of mortality in ways that I didn't expect. I've been present for hundreds of deaths now. I don't know even what the count is, and some of you probably maybe for thousands. And I think it's true to say each one has taught something different about human experience. You've probably seen people die with profound peace, but there's also those who have died who have struggled until their final breath. And there's been some deaths that are so good to me, seemingly, that they felt sacred. And then there's been other deaths that felt deeply tragic, the kinds that I had to kind of go home and deal with secondary trauma afterwards. And of course, we see families come together in beautiful ways around death and families torn by conflict because of death. And so these experiences, I'll just admit to you all, have made me both more afraid of death and less afraid too, which I know probably makes no sense to say. But there are just ways, like new fears have been unlocked about ways of dying in this work. And then in other ways, I've become less fearful of death because I think I'm much more aware of how precious life is. The one singular thing about palliative care as a philosophy in medicine is it really does believe that there is such a thing as a good death. And I've realized through the work that a good death can be a lot of different things. And if anything, the many deaths that I've seen have taught me that the dying process often continues the pattern of how somebody has lived their life. So if you're in a room where there's 30 people and they're full of love and sharing memories about the person that's laying in that bed, you can tell a lot about the impact that person's life has had on the people around them. And I think at its best, being present for death has really taught me about the resilience of love. And that's something I'm really thankful for, because love is kind of an abstract thing. But I think you and I, in the work of chaplaincy, see love transcend physical deterioration or love transcend cognitive decline or really even death itself. So seeing families discover depths of connections that they didn't know existed, I think is a pretty incredible thing. So there's richness there for sure. Now, let me end with talking about the challenges, which it's timely as I become emotional thinking about this particular thing. One challenge I don't think I was prepared for was the cumulative effect of loss. In other chaplaincy settings, you encounter death kind of occasionally, but in palliative care, it feels like it's kind of constant. And you can lose, patients on a pretty regular basis. And I think carrying the combined memory of the grief of hundreds of families can become its own challenge and a spiritual challenge at that. And it's not just about processing individual deaths, for me at least, but it's about living with the constant awareness of human fragility and the inevitability of loss. And so I've had to develop some new spiritual practices to cope with that reality and to create some space, right, for my own grief about losing patients and being present to this. Um, Palliative care is the kind of thing that really requires you to do things that will ensure that you're taking care of yourself and making sure that you are staying healthy in the game. Some of the things that I would recommend people do in that regard is make sure that you are seeking regular supervision and peer support. Uh, I'm really blessed to work within a team where we do a lot of processing together in a daily huddle and informally throughout the day and supporting each other whenever there's been hard things. We have a really healthy culture here of supporting each other in the work. And our institutional system offers regular counseling benefit. You get so many free counseling sessions a year and stuff like that, which I think is really great. But I think it's important in this work to develop personal spiritual practices that will nourish you. Um, I have some self-care strategies that have been really helpful for me. I'm very blessed and privileged to have a really strong, my wife Rachel, we've been married for 25 years, very loving relationship, and I have 4 children and a very loving home environment. I do things outside of the hospital that give me a lot of life. I compete in strength sports as a competitive strongman and do some things that are very life-giving activities for me. And so professional therapy when needed, but also outdoor therapy. And I've found it really important to keep some clear boundaries between work and personal life. And so, for example, for me, that looks like I have been asked to do funerals. And I know hospice chaplains on this call probably get asked to do that and do that all the time. I just don't have the bandwidth for that. And so, in very few instances, have I done funerals for patients who've died, unless it's been a kind of extraordinary case. Now, I also work in a local church, and so I have responsibilities pastorally in that space. And so, but I try to keep some boundaries between here and my personal life. I do regularly try to take time away. I've not always been very good about this using my PTO, but I've gotten a lot better in the last year because you need to regularly take time away from the intensity of palliative care. And physical care, exercise, nutrition, sleep, really good sleep. These are all important things. Um, what are the signs that I've noticed that I need additional support? I tend to find that my grief and my maybe stress levels show up in sleep problems. So if I start noticing sleep disruption, I know that it's become a little bit too heavy and I need to think about things. We all know about uh, compassion fatigue. Feeling emotionally numb or disconnected, I think, is a reality that we have to be aware of in our lives. If a person sees increased irritability or conflict in personal relationships, that can be a sign that your chaplaincy work is a little unbalanced and you need to find some restorative things to do. Obviously, substance use as a coping mechanism is a very dangerous and slippery path. And so I counsel and do orientations for the new nurses in our hospital. And I'm talking a lot about healthy coping strategies, but those are for us as well. There can be times where we lose meaning in our work or have physical symptoms in our life, pain and headaches and stuff without really a medical cause. I think some of those things are related to the stress or the grief and other things like that. Or even if you find yourself avoiding certain types of patients or situations, those may be signs that additional support is needed. I want to kind of wind down here with just a quick story and then kind of close things out. And would love to hear comments or maybe questions. But I live in Michigan, and we were up in a really beautiful part of the upper lower peninsula of Michigan, an area called the Leelanau Peninsula. The Leelanau Peninsula is pretty extraordinary. It contains, or it's near to what's considered one of the most beautiful lakes in the country, Torch Lake. And it also is near to Lake Michigan, where there's a really unique seaside or lakeside ecology called sand dunes, big dunes that build up erosional features. It's incredible. And one of those is a national park called Sleeping Bear Dunes. My family and I were up there last year. Mid-October in Michigan is incredibly beautiful. Fall foliage colors like you'd never believe. And so we took PTO and got up there. And so the weather was still pretty nice for Michigan, pretty warm, warm enough that one day we decided to go to a place called Crystal Lake near where we were staying in an Airbnb. And the scene is this: it's this little rock strewn shore, beautiful water, actually pretty unseasonably warm day. So it was beautiful. Both of my kids, 11 and 8 years old, in their bathing suits in the water, right? Everybody wants to get into fall and winter, but we're still rocking the bathing suits. And um, Rachel, my wife, she was just having a ball looking for little fossils and things in the rocks on the shore. And so they're the picture of life, and they're loving this moment. I'm sitting there in Crystal Lake and I'm watching them, but I've settled into a camp chair and it's like day 3 of vacation. And so the adrenals have relaxed and I've got some time away from the hospital, and all of the cumulative stuff that's been kind of packed down is starting to come up. And when I was sitting there, I felt completely melancholy, like sad. This moment I wanted to last forever felt transient. And I was like a 10,000 yard stare off in the the distance. And Rachel didn't notice it. The kids didn't notice it. Nobody noticed it because nobody was around. I bet if my friend Paul or one of you were sitting next to me, you would have looked at me and been like, "Hey, how are you doing over there?" You know, because I was 10,000 yards away. And I realized the impact of some of this work, right? That we do carry it with us outside of the hospital or wherever we're working at. Um, I was I was transported, and I realized that there is a kind of cumulative grief that builds up, and we can experience moral distress and other things like that. And yet, this work and the privilege of this calling remains. I really can't imagine doing any other work. I've just learned I have to really care for myself in this work. But to be invited into people's most vulnerable moments and to witness the full spectrum of human experience in the space of palliative care is a profound privilege. And I think I'm very lucky to do it, very blessed to do it. And the work has convinced me, of course, that every person carries within them something sacred that really deserves recognition and respect and care. And it's also taught me that healing is possible even when a cure is not. So I do believe in the concept of the good death in palliative care, which is a part of that philosophy. And that meaning can emerge from very difficult circumstances. And love, which I talked about before, kind of emotionally, is stronger than death. So I do want to end where it all began with the recognition that the work is very meaningful and it's changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I came into palliative care thinking I understood chaplaincy and suffering and death, and I've learned that maybe that understanding was just the beginning. And so for those of you doing chaplaincy in other settings, I hope some of the reflections I've maybe shared today have resonated with your own. The specifics of palliative care may be a little bit different in ways from what work you're doing, but I do think our fundamental calling remains the same: to walk with people through their most profound experiences and to offer presence in the midst of crisis. So, wherever it is that you're working, I just want to affirm that you are working a very sacred work. You're offering something that I think the world desperately needs. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my reflections today with you. Thank you for your own commitment to chaplaincy and spiritual care. And thank you for the reminder that this work we do, whatever the setting, touches the very heart of what it means to be human. So let me be quiet now and hear what you have to think or to ask or to say or to offer for all of us. That way I can drink coffee.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate your thoughts. I worked for several years in a level one trauma hospital also. Uh, can you say more about what you meant by the resilience of love?
Yeah, I think love, you know, maybe I'm thinking about it in terms of its lasting effect, but so oftentimes when in a family system a loved one is dying, there's there's a multifaceted love presence in there. One is on behalf of the patient who I think maybe you can relate to this. A lot of times patients feel guilty about dying because they're not going to be there to provide for and to do all the things that they want to be able to do for their loved ones. So there's that aspect of love. But then there's, on the other hand, for the families, their own experience of how they love this patient, right? The memory sharing and the other things, what they're losing, but also what they want to give to the patient, right? Giving them permission, saying it's okay to go. You know, how many times have you been at the end of life where maybe the patient's not been interacting anymore, but they're saying it's okay to go, mom, it's okay to go, dad, and just seeing the gift of love there, but also so many promises made at the deathbed, right? That we're going to carry on so much of what mom cherished, right? Or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that as a way of loving. So in that sense, I think of love as being a very resilient thing that really can only exist within the web of relationships between people. And so I can't pretend to exhaust what what I think I mean when I say love is resilient, but I think about it in those specific ways of how it exists within these family systems. And when it's there, it sure is beautiful. When it's not there, it's kind of heartbreaking. Thank you for that, Gary.
Thank you. Yes, very good.
Thank you.
Uh, you perhaps answered this at the beginning, but is the recording going to be available to everybody?
Yes, yes. Renee Paul is doing the recording, and she'll make the recording available as soon as they have to do a little processing, and she'll send it out to the group.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting this. This has been a good reflection, and appreciate all the work you put into preparing for this, Matthew.
My pleasure, Gary. Thank you for being here. And I'm glad to know others that have worked in the level one trauma centers. It's not for the faint of heart, but it sure is rich work for sure.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's rewarding.
Yes, it is.
We are a little past the top of the hour. Uh, any other comments or questions for Matthew?
I make just one final comment. A lot of the skill sets that I've been able to build in palliative care space, I think are really relevant to chaplains in general. And I want to mention one specifically, the ability to navigate goal of care conversations with patients and families. Oftentimes, I find that chaplains are the most nimble, lean member of the team, able to get into spaces where maybe even while still in the emergency department, goals of care need to be determined and assessed. And long before an entire palliative care team can get there, the chaplain is often there. So if you're in a setting where you would benefit from growing your skill in goals of care conversations or even code status changes or other things like that, I would really encourage you to maybe partner with a peer who's able to do that kind of work or do some research on your own about it, because I think this is a place where chaplains can make a really determined impact upon patient care, and we're often able to do it more quickly than others, and it can mean a world of difference for patient dispositions and other things like that. So I didn't talk about that specifically today, but I think if anything, palliative care chaplains do that work so often. If you know somebody in your institution that does that kind of work and you want to grow in your skill set there, I'd really encourage that. That can be beneficial. That's all, Paul. I'll be quiet now. Sorry.
Okay, well, thanks, Matthew. Thanks for all of you for your participation. Just one housekeeping note. Our next Lunch and Learn will be on October 2nd, uh, 12 noon Central Time. Adam Metz will be presenting on providing spiritual care in an increasingly secular world. And so we'll get more information to you about that presentation as the time draws nearer.